So we have studied the Constitutional Convention, the various articles of the Constitution created at the Constitutional Convention, as well as going through the powers of Congress and the structure of Congress in detail. Now what I'd like to do is go through the structure of the executive branch, which is the president, and their powers. So, some important terms to know. Roles of the president. First, chief executive. Through his cabinet of advisors and a massive bureaucracy, the president enforces all the laws. So Congress, through the process of how a bill becomes a law, passes bills into law. The president has to sign them or veto them. That veto could be overridden by Congress, but once it is officially law, it is up to the president to enforce the law, and that is his role as chief executive. Commander-in-chief. As commander-in-chief, the president outranks every general and admiral in the military and can overrule any of their ideas or demand his own ideas. Even though he is a civilian, he is in charge of all the military. As chief diplomat, the president is in charge of making treaties with other nations, although they must be approved with a 2/3 majority vote of the Senate. The president nominates U.S. ambassadors to other nations, which also requires a majority vote, a simple majority vote. And the president can invite ambassadors or leaders even of other nations to visit the United States and discuss the major issues. This is a photograph of Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, during the Vietnam War, and he is meeting with General William Westmoreland, who was the commanding general in Vietnam, and the two of them were obviously discussing strategy and policy in Vietnam. This is a photograph of Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan, meeting with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, and these two had a good working relationship that helped ease some of the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, including a scaling back of the number of nuclear weapons that were being produced. More roles of the president is chief of state. This means that the nation is to be kept informed on domestic and foreign policy, both through informal means, which today would be an interview on television, or a press conference via the president's press secretary, and formal means, such as the State of the Union address that happens every year. The president also has a judicial role. As president, an individual can grant pardons, which is a forgiveness of a federal crime to people, and reprieves, which is the delaying of a punishment, whenever he so chooses, or she so chooses. The president also nominates Supreme Court justices when there is a vacancy on the court. However, the Senate must confirm, which is simply to approve of, the person chosen. This only requires a simple majority. This is a photograph of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, better known as FDR, and he is giving a press conference to the public during the Great Depression, and this is his role as Chief of State. This is the Supreme Court swearing in of Justice Clarence Thomas, appointed by President Bush, who is slightly behind him, and to the left and behind him is President Bush's wife, Barbara Bush. This is the president's judiciary role. The election process includes national conventions. Each party holds these conventions and chooses their candidate. If the losing person doesn't agree, they can challenge the person in what is called a primary election. So an election before the election, kind of. And then the general election, which is the main election, people vote in favor of a certain president or vice president ticket. The people are in fact voting on electors who cast their votes on behalf of them in the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a very complicated system, but the number of electors from each state is really based on population. So the way they do it is they take the number of people representing you in the House of Representatives plus your 2 senators, and that is your total value in the Electoral College. Very rarely would an elector place their vote against the wishes of the public in the election. New York, as an example, is worth 31 electoral votes, which means there are 29 congressional districts and 2 senators. More populous states, therefore, have more electors and receive a lot more of the campaign attention from the candidates than would a small state. Whoever wins a plurality, which is a majority of the electoral votes, wins the election. A majority in the current Electoral College system is 270 votes. What if there is no majority? The House of Representatives votes when there is a tie vote or no plurality. So, examples of unusual elections. The most famous example early in U.S. history is in 1800. The House of Representatives had to break a tie vote because Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, oddly enough they were both from the Democratic-Republican Party, received 73 votes in what was then a much smaller electoral college. The result is that the House of Representatives chooses to elect Thomas Jefferson as president. Another election was the election of 1824. It was the defeat of the more popular candidate. The result was that with no plurality, the House of Representatives voted. John Quincy Adams ultimately won the election, even though Andrew Jackson was the more popular candidate. So Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote. He even had the most electoral votes. But this is not a majority or plurality. So the House of Representatives had to choose the president, and they chose John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson. Their justification was really that he had more governmental experience and that Jackson was only really a military veteran. But this was very unpopular among the people because the people had voted in a majority of the popular vote and a majority of the electoral vote, but not what was required in the Electoral College. The election of 1876, the defeat of a more popular candidate again. With no plurality, a special commission decides the election in favor of Rutherford B. Hayes. You can see with a little more than 200,000 popular votes, Samuel Tilden won the most popular votes. Rutherford B. Hayes, however, had the most electoral votes, but again, this number was not the necessary plurality in the election. So this special commission appointed Rutherford B. Hayes as the president. The deal that was made was that he would pull troops out of the South and end the current federal Reconstruction policies that were put in place after the Civil War, and this effectively ended Reconstruction. So the election of 1876, and Rutherford B. Hayes therefore taking office in 1877, makes that a very significant date in American history, because Reconstruction effectively ends the minute Rutherford B. Hayes is elected to office. In 1888, there is the defeat of a more popular candidate again. Benjamin Harrison, although having the less popular vote, won an electoral majority. So in this odd case, a little under 100,000 votes were cast in favor of Grover Cleveland over Benjamin Harrison in the popular vote, but Benjamin Harrison had clearly campaigned in more populated congressional districts, and therefore it added up to a clear electoral majority. This didn't even have a disputed electoral vote. It went clearly in the favor of Benjamin Harrison. Most famous to us in the modern world is the election of 2000, which is the defeat of the more popular candidate again. The situation is that Al Gore, who was the sitting vice president at the time, demanded a recount of ballots in certain counties in the state of Florida that he believed were miscounted. The result was that the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in the famous Supreme Court case Bush v. Gore in the same year as the election, 2000, that the recount was unconstitutional because it was a violation of both Florida state election laws as well as the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection. We will learn about that amendment in much greater detail at the end of our Civil War unit. Equal protection essentially was used because if you only recount certain counties in the state of Florida, then you were treating some people in one county differently than you would treat people in other counties. So the Supreme Court decision gave what is President George W. Bush the victory over Vice President Al Gore in the election, and it is very, very controversial because the margin of victory is a slim 5 electoral votes, but the 271 is 1 vote higher than the required majority, even though there was a gap of almost 500,000 votes giving Al Gore the popular vote majority. The recounts, interestingly enough, continued just for the sake of doing them afterwards, and although by an even slimmer margin than he already had, George W. Bush was declared the clear winner of the state of Florida. So despite the fact that there's still controversy today because these are very, very different people, George W. Bush and Al Gore were very, very different people politically. So some people loved one and hated the other, and vice versa, loved the other, hated the first person. So it is very controversial, even though really the outcome is pretty decisive. This is a political cartoon of the two of them tugging on the presidential seal. Perhaps one of the most controversial elections ever is actually most recently. In 2016, President Trump defeated his opponent, Hillary Rodham Clinton, in the Electoral College vote by what appears to be a rather large margin, and then lost the popular vote by an opposite large margin. This over 3 million vote loss in the popular vote, yet a win in the Electoral College, brought more controversy than perhaps ever before to the system of the Electoral College in general. So there have been a lot of calls for changes to or outright abolishment of the Electoral College after the 2016 election. Rules of presidential succession. In 1947, an act of Congress clarified the rules of presidential succession. And that shows that the president, if he is dead or incapacitated for any reason, then gives power to the vice president, who then goes to the Speaker of the House, which then goes to President pro tempore of the Senate, and lastly, cabinet members in the order of the department's creation. So, for example, the first would be the Secretary of State, because that was the first created position in the presidential cabinet by George Washington way back in 1788. The 22nd Amendment stated that no person may serve more than 2 elected terms as president. This was decided after FDR won the presidency 4 times. Also, the 25th Amendment in 1967 said, what if the president is disabled by injury or sickness? The solution is that the vice president can temporarily be given power in the same structure we just looked at, and that the vice president and the majority of the cabinet members can declare that the president is unfit to discharge the powers and duties of his office, which this is a famous example from a Hollywood movie called Air Force One, in which Harrison Ford plays President of the United States, and when Air Force One is hijacked and he is on the plane, he is technically unfit to discharge the powers and duties of his office. His vice presidential candidate, who at the time in the movie is a woman by the name of Glenn Close, refuses to sign the paperwork filled out by other members of the cabinet, and therefore still keeping the presidential powers with the president aboard the hijacked Air Force One. Very, very, very dramatized, obviously, but an example nonetheless. Lastly, if the president disagrees that he is unfit, he cannot be forced out without a 2/3 majority vote of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. On the left is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the 21st Amendment was required after he had been elected 4 times, and people vehemently disagreed with that. And then on the right is the Time magazine cover from when President Ronald Reagan had been shot. And while he was temporarily incapacitated in the hospital, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, took office temporarily. The removal of the president by impeachment is also an interesting example of the balance of power and checks and balances in the government. The Constitution has a provision for removal of the president, and any other public official for that matter. The charges are often boiled down to the language from the Constitution that simply says high crimes and misdemeanors. So what is the process for removal? A simple majority, so just over 50% of the House of Representatives, can vote for a trial. The Senate meets as a trial court led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the Senate is technically the jury, and the Chief Justice is technically the judge. Only a 2/3 majority vote of the Senate voting for conviction can remove a sitting president. No president has ever been removed from office after the articles of impeachment have been underway, but there have been 2 presidents who were impeached and 1 president who most definitely would have been impeached but resigned from office.
Only 3 presidents have ever actually been impeached, and none of them were removed from office. Andrew Johnson in 1868 was impeached after the radical Republicans in Congress and he had a major disagreement about Reconstruction policy. So they find kind of like a technicality that he violated an act of Congress and impeached him. He was acquitted. He did not get removed from office. In 1998, Bill Clinton was impeached after committing perjury over a rumored sexual relationship with a White House intern. It turned out to be true, and he had perjured himself, which just means lied, well under oath during a court proceeding. And then most recently, Donald Trump was impeached in both 2019 and 2020. The first impeachment was over accusations of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And it was in relation to an interaction he had with a foreign leader, asking that leader to investigate his political enemies. He was also acquitted on those charges. He was impeached a second time after accusations of inciting the riot that stormed the U.S. Capitol building. He was also acquitted on those charges. So we've never had a president removed from office. One president, however, resigned before he could be impeached because he knew not only would he be impeached, but he would likely be removed from office and convicted. Richard Nixon, in 1974, tried to help cover up a crime and then lied about his involvement in the cover-up, and this is commonly known as the Watergate scandal. And we'll cover mainly Johnson, Clinton, and Nixon. Donald Trump is so current events that the likelihood we need to talk a whole lot about that is not all that expected, because people have heard all about it. It's been in recent news. But we will discuss as we get to the Civil War Reconstruction period, the Johnson impeachment, as we get to the 90s, the Clinton impeachment, and then when we're covering the 60s and 70s, the Nixon impeachment. You see some visuals here. Here's Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, and of course, Trump.
The Unwritten Constitution. This is an important term because this is things that are seen as commonplace in our modern political system that really weren't written in the Constitution. They were just common practices that kind of becomes a part of our system that everyone agrees is a lawful and acceptable part of the system. Political parties is one. There is absolutely nothing in the Constitution concerning political parties, but 2 main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, do still exist. As a matter of fact, in George Washington's farewell address, he advises against becoming a member of a political party because he thinks it is entirely too divisive. I tend to agree with that statement, but nonetheless, we do still have 2 main political parties today. George Washington's two-term tradition was not an official policy, but was followed until FDR was elected to 4 terms throughout the 1930s and 40s, which was, again, cause for the 22nd Amendment in 1951. The presidential cabinet, again, there is nothing in the Constitution, but George Washington shows that it is a very successful system for getting multiple opinions, and therefore it has been used by every president since. It is not quite as authentic today because usually the cabinet of advisors are all people that will just tell the president, yes, Mr. President, everything you say and do is the right thing to do, whereas George Washington had really had a lot of advisors that vehemently disagreed with each other and argued quite a bit. He liked it that way, though, because he knew he could make a well-informed decision. So, political parties, two-term tradition that eventually calls for the 22nd Amendment, and the presidential cabinet are all parts of the unwritten Constitution. The Democrats are portrayed by the donkey on the left, and the Republicans portrayed by the elephant on the right. There are a couple other parties that are very different from the two mainstream parties, one being the Socialist Party of the United States, the other being the Libertarian Party of the United States, and they offer very different views from the two main parties that are often accused of not being different enough for the people to make an informed decision in an election. Here's a joke. If not for the 22nd Amendment, I'd still be president. This is Bill Clinton coming out to campaign on behalf of President Barack Obama. This is a joke because Barack Obama is very unpopular, and President Bill Clinton was a very popular president and could very well have been continuously reelected like FDR. This is the first presidential cabinet. The people seated are George Washington himself, the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. That is the conclusion of our presentation on the presidency. Please make sure that you take the online quiz. Use your notes. Take your time. This was a lengthy presentation, and you should really be careful taking the online quiz. Using your notes really means there's no reason you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.